Hi there, welcome to another episode of the RevOps Show. This is part one of a two-part series where Doug and Jess dive into the world of forecasting. Today, they're staying positive, breaking down why forecasting is essential, and exploring different forecasting methods. They get into 5 different methods along with the pros and cons of each. We should be utilizing different forecasting methods for different needs. So if you're looking to get a clearer picture of how to utilize forecasts for your business, this episode is for you.
Oh my God, Jess, today's a huge day.
2 RevOps show in 1 week. That's what you're excited about. I know it.
You know, today is such a big day. That's not what I'm excited about.
I knew you were going to do this.
I thought that's why you scheduled it for today. What am I going to do, Jess?
I desperately didn't want to schedule it for today because I knew you were going to do this, but it was the only time we could make it work.
What am I going to do?
You're going to try to embarrass me, and I just really I'm not in the mood.
What about today would be something that could possibly embarrass you?
I have survived 8 years at Lift Enablement.
Survived? Oh, wow.
Which was previously at Imagine Business Development / Lift Enablement.
Easily the smartest decision I've made.
I don't know about that. Just give it time. Give it some more time.
I will. You were supposed to say, "Oh, me too." That's what you were supposed to say.
Me too. Slice that together, Hannah.
8 wonderful years, Jess.
You know how I gauge how long I've been here?
How old your kids are? How old
Elena is? Yeah, because I had a baby, and then I started 6 weeks later.
In fairness, you accepted the job before that, right?
Yes, I'm pretty sure I did. Yes.
We didn't make you come back. We didn't pull you from the maternity ward.
No. My mommy chips broke, and I was ready to come back at 6 weeks.
I hear you. I am listening to the most fascinating audiobook I think I've ever listened to.
What book is that?
Surrender. 40 songs, one story. It's Bono's autobiography.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And it's a full production. So each chapter is a song.
Okay. Yeah.
So he plays part of a song from his catalog, right? As you're coming in. He was talking about, in one of the early chapters, he's talking about Bob Dylan said that. And a Bob Dylan song played in the background as he's talking.
Oh, that's amazing.
He's sharing a lyric relative to something, and in the background of him speaking it or sort of singing it, you're hearing one of the live performances of the song.
Are you getting ideas for your audiobook?
I'm like, we need to have a song for every chapter in the revenue acceleration framework. Now, it is fascinating because there is absolutely no chronology whatsoever to the book. I mean, we're in 1970, then 2019, then I'm at any point, especially because I listen to this mainly while I'm walking or something. If my attention drifts,
mm-hmm.
I realize that happens very rarely for me. But if my attention drifts and I come back into the book, he might be talking about something, and I had this realization yesterday. I'm like, I have no idea where in time we are right now. The other thing it did is it really made me realize how old I am.
Because of the year that some of the years that the songs came out, is that why?
Yeah, he's talking about Octung Baby, and I remember. Well, I don't remember the show. I remember being at the show. I remember standing up I had field seats. I remember standing up on a chair
mm-hmm.
on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being in the car waiting for people to get to the car for us to leave the show.
Oh, okay.
That was the second song of Zoo TV Tour.
Okay.
So I kind of remember the second song, and I remember being in the car, and I don't remember anything in between.
What year was this?
It would have been 92, 93.
Oh, okay. Yep.
But I think of U2, and I think of that album as being like, yeah, that was a recent, like it was pretty, that was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. No, it was 30 years ago.
Yep. Yep.
Just, I'm not old enough to have seen a band in concert 30 years ago. Right.
I don't know.
How is that possible?
I am not old enough to have seen a band that was in concert 30 years ago. I can tell you that.
I agree with you. All right, Jess, what are we talking about today?
You wanted to hurt my head today, I think. We're talking about forecasting.
What would you like to talk about forecasting?
This was your topic, so I'd like you to tee us up. Because I'd like to talk about nothing about forecasting. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, so what should we talk about instead?
Can we talk about the Disney announcements instead? That's what we should talk about.
Didn't we do that earlier? Didn't we do that on the last episode?
We can unpack all of them. No, tee us up.
So this is obviously not the first time we've talked about forecasting. We continue to see in various go-to-market research, nature of kind of where we are in the business cycle, forecasting continues to show up as one of the top pain points, one of the top areas of dissatisfactions for most businesses, and especially mid-market businesses. And so I thought it might be worth us kind of like, we've talked in the past about what's wrong with forecasting, why forecasting doesn't work.
Yep.
Here, and I think we decided that this is not going to be a one episode play.
Yep.
Here, I wanted to dig a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of forecasting and kind of make it a little bit more, what can I take away from this so that I can improve my forecasting. So that's what I want to talk about. So
we're going to be positive on this episode, or these two episodes is what I'm hearing.
How could we be anything other than positive on your 8th Liftiversary?
Exactly. So let's start with talking about what's the problem around forecasting.
So, Jess, you misread the prep material.
Did I misread it?
You did.
Okay.
Because the point that I'm making here is not the problem with forecasting. It's the problem that is forecasting.
Okay.
Right? So forecasting would be the noun. I don't know.
What is the problem that is forecasting?
I was never very good at diagramming sentences. I think that forecasting there's a false perception of what forecasting is.
Okay. Which is?
Boy, I haven't used this term in a long time, Jess. I think people view forecasting through a lens of a deterministic versus a probabilistic. And so forecasting, if you think about what forecasting is,
mm-hmm.
Forecasting is synonymous. Actually, let's ask forecasting definition. Predict or estimate a future event or trend. Predict or estimate, right? That's a good definition. I like
mm-hmm.
that. This Oxford dictionary, I think it's got legs. I think it's going places.
Oh yeah.
It explains words pretty well. Forecasting is predictability.
Okay.
Right. But we talk about, and by the way, what's the most common forecast people see and talk about? Let's see if you come up with what I think.
The most popular one?
The most common.
The most common one?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
it doesn't have to be business.
Oh, really? Oh, weather. Thank you. Right. Thank you. Weather.
And so when you look at your weather app and you look at the forecast for tomorrow and it's going to rain tomorrow, what does your weather app say?
The percentage.
Percent.
Yeah, the percentage.
Right. And so, because whenever you're predicting the future, there's always going to be variability.
Yeah.
Right. And so the reason that forecasting is so important is because without forecasting, you don't have predictability. Like predictability creates context, creates rules so that you can make decisions. Just, did you know that the word decide and the word homicide both have the same suffix and mean the same thing? It doesn't have the same ring.
I did know that.
It doesn't have the same ring as the same Latin root. Making decisions is hard.
Mm-hmm.
You know what another word for making a decision is?
What?
Making a bet.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I love it when people say, if I were a betting person, and I always say, well, you are. Because when you get out of bed, you're making a bet.
Yeah. When you put it that way.
Right. It's a pretty high probability bet. It's a pretty safe bet, but it's still a bet.
Sure.
Have you ever gotten out of bed and, like, I know, Jess, this has never happened to you. Gotten out of bed and you couldn't stand up because you didn't know this, but your knee was locked, or your knee was in.
It's never happened to me. It's happened to me multiple times.
Right. I mean, I know it's happened to me where I've gotten out of bed and, like, I've almost collapsed.
Yeah.
Right. I think if I had known that I was going to collapse, I probably wouldn't gotten up, or I wouldn't gotten up the way I did, or whatever. Right. So I made a bet and lost. And so we are always making bets, right? Every action we're taking is a bet on the situation. We get in our car and drive. We're betting that no one is going to be driving in the opposite manner, looking to take us out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And most days we're there. And, we've talked about this before. Decisions take up a lot of calories. They take up a lot of energy. I remember when we were off site and we were having the conversation with the COO of one of our clients, and we both agreed. I think I said to him, if I could have one day that I didn't have to make a decision, that would be, and he said, dude, if I could have 4 hours.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that's a good point. Right. And by the way, one of the things, like, why are market cycles and turns so painful? Why have the last 5 years been just so exhausting to everybody? Well, the predictability is gone. There is so much variance. And so the place where we get ourselves into trouble is we have this perception that a forecast is supposed to, like, we will do X.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this comes from, public companies report their earnings, and somehow, amazingly, for 27 consecutive quarters, they're, even there, they still don't deliver the number. As a matter of fact, especially if you're in a decent environment, if you deliver on the number, that's a problem. You have to exceed the number.
Right.
Right. And so we're in this pursuit of certainty. That's the first problem that puts you into this place of forecasting, creating craziness, that deterministic instead of probabilistic. And then the second thing is, for it to be predictable, forecasting is the end of good process. It's not the beginning of good process.
What do you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
Are we do we have good data? Are we tracking the right things? Are we utilizing the tools we're supposed to be utilizing? As those things are working, as our systems are working, we get the data that we need to increase predictability, right? But, like, the number of times that I hear somebody say that, our forecasting, there's something wrong with our CRM because our forecasting is bad. And really what it turns out is there's nothing wrong with your forecasting. You don't have remember the client we worked with, we have, our CRM shows we have 400 MQLs.
Yeah.
But it's not turning into the 100 SQLs and 50 wins that our model calls for.
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem's not the forecast. The problem is the model.
Right.
Right. And the problem is also, those aren't really MQLs.
Yeah.
We should do an MQL episode, Jess.
We should.
Right. So that is the problem that is forecasting. Forecasting in and of itself is not one thing. Forecasting is the combination.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a parlay. I'm going to gambling. By the way, when most people say if I were a betting person, what they really mean is if I were a gambling person.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. So you talked about forecasting being predictability. Why else is forecasting important?
Well, that's kind of why forecasting is important, because without predictability, how do you make decisions? And if you think about it, I can't decide anything in the moment, because the moment there's at least an a nanosecond passes. Like when I go swat ball away, it might feel like I'm doing it instantaneously, but it's still decision action.
Yep.
Right. And it's like, if you're, one of my favorite things, not favorite things to do is to be sitting right behind the plate at a baseball game with the screen, foul ball comes straight back. 90% of the people, 90% of the time dodge out of the way, even though they actually know that there's a screen there, the ball can't hit them.
Right.
But again, the predictability engine says danger, move. And by the way, the cost of movement, right? If you're wrong, not that big of a deal. So it really comes down to, if you're running an organization, if you're running a business, if you're running a team, how do you place your bets? How do you make your decisions? Where do you allocate your time? Where do you allocate your resources? Right? I mean, really, business management is all about resource allocation.
Yeah.
Right. Resource allocation, time, money, and energy.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you don't pursue something with enough effort and commitment, then you can't get the payback. But if you put that effort and commitment and it turns out you're wrong, you have a huge cost. It's the, we used a first round draft choice on a quarterback who flamed out, sets the organization back. I think it's considered to be like it's a 3-year mistake. It takes 3 years to recover from drafting a quarterback in the first round that doesn't work out.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Something like that. I don't know. People who know far more about football have, I don't know. They could be making it up. They probably are.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because you build a whole lot of things around it, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have predictability, you can't have scale, right? If you don't have predictability, all you can do is throw lots of things randomly at lots of things. I mean, there is a degree, especially in a hyper growth case, that's what you're doing, right? That's why you go out and you raise a whole lot of money. I spend $10 million to generate $2 million. The theory is that there's a learning behind that increases the predictability. But without forecasting, you have a variance that is just far too, it becomes far too big, both from the standpoint of how to run a business, how to allocate resources, but also like whether you have that forecast or not, mentally, you're going to have that forecast because you just can't operate, right? And that's why displacements are so painful is that all of the mechanisms that you've used to create that rules base to make your, for lack of a broader, even mental forecast wipes out. And it's like, okay, well, if I don't trust any of the data that I'm seeing, right? If companies are spending X% more on, and all of a sudden that's not happening.
Yep. Where
do I go to be able to base something on to go about and take action? And so yet at the same time, and I think this is the hardest thing about leading or running an organization. And that is your people, your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, your stockholders can't operate without a level of certainty. And the closer you are to reality, the more you are aware of the ambiguity.
Yep.
Right. And so how do you build certainty, which is really a level of confidence,
Mm-hmm.
when you're immersed in ambiguity?
Yep.
And that's why forecasting is important.
That makes sense. So let's talk about the different types of forecasting and what they are, the different pros and cons to each.
So we're going to talk about 5 types of forecasting, and if somebody wanted to get technical, you could probably come up with 17 more types. We are not going to get overly technical here, so I'm not going to be talking about regression analyses. I find that I'm more of a progressive, not a regressive. You are the progress you seek.
You are positive today. See, it's just a ball of positivity.
I am a ball of positivity. So we're going to talk about waterfall or funnel-based forecasting.
Yep.
And again, I want to emphasize, when you're talking about forecasting, you're talking about predictions. Waterfall, funnel-based. We're going to talk about stage-based.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's become increasingly common is what I refer to as the commits-based forecast, the bottom-up forecast, and a top-down forecast. As we talk about this, I want to emphasize we're going to talk about each one individually, but you can run multiple types of forecasting. And I would say the ultimately you do want to run multiple types of forecasting. Also, we are going to address this from a standpoint of predominantly we're talking about sales and new sales. I will touch a little bit on revenue, but there's also 2 very different types of forecasts. We should note, by the way, that if you want to get into some of the details and see the models on this, we do have a business model. And so we have a growth models course. It's a free course online. One of the modules is about forecasting. So when you look at forecasting, there's, one of the questions you have to ask is, what are you forecasting? And over what period of time are you forecasting? Right. The what could be, are we forecasting new business, new sales? Or are we forecasting revenue?
Yeah.
Right. And if we're forecasting revenue, are we forecasting new revenue? Are we forecasting all revenue? And please realize that your sales forecast, and trust me, I've made this mistake. Your sales forecast and your revenue forecast are not the same thing. Even your new revenue forecast, right? I win the business on day 1. It is not ordinary that I get all of the revenue on day 1. So you run your forecast and you say, hey, we're gonna close $100,000 a month, $1.2 million. You go out, you spend $800,000, and then wait, where did this go? So let's talk about waterfall funnel based first.
Okay.
Right. So what it is it predominantly is using historical data, leveraging what you have about your existing funnel. So you're looking at leads. How many leads do you have now? How many leads have you been generating? What's your lead velocity? What's your lead growth rate? What's the value of a lead? What's the sales cycle? This is why sales cycle, the reason that sales cycle has the oomph that it has as a metric is because of its impact on forecasting. Right? If it takes me 60 days to close a piece of business versus 180 days versus whatever else, that obviously is going to have a dramatic impact on how things lay out from a forecasting standpoint.
So is that like, if I have 100 leads that have historically on average come in every 30 days, looking at what's existing, I should expect that. And if I have a certain percentage of growth over the last 6 months, that goes out. Okay.
So we're generating 100 leads a month. We expect, we've seen our leads grow at 15% per year. We're doing X, Y, and Z to increase that to 30% growth. Our funnel conversion looks like X. This was, if you go back and you listen to, Inbound Marketing 101, Inbound Marketing SLAs, things like that, that's very much based on a waterfall or funnel based.
Yep.
And what you're doing here, you've got a couple of things in it. Like the situation where it tends to make the most sense is high volume and usually short or comparatively short, depending upon what your construct is, short sales cycles. So like if I have a 5-week sales cycle, right? How can I predict next quarter's revenue, let alone this year's revenue?
Yeah.
Right. Like if I have if I have a 5.2 week sales cycle, that means 90% of my business doesn't exist at the beginning of the year. 90% of the business I'm going to win doesn't exist at the beginning of the year. So how do you forecast for that? Right?
Yep.
Any questions on that?
Nope. That makes sense.
So the advantage of the waterfall, and people love waterfall models, right? The advantage of the waterfall is there's an objectiveness to it, right? We're not asking you, what do you think? What do you feel?
Yeah.
Right? There is or should be a data construct to it.
Yeah.
Now here again, that data construct, that data model is only as good as, well, the data and the model.
Yep.
Right. It provides a clear forecast.
Yeah.
Right. It creates that certainty. And I'll tell you, this is the natural element everybody wants to go to is to have that waterfall element. And by the way, waterfalls are typically they're done very well in spreadsheets. So what they do is they provide linear progression.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so if I'm going to model, we've got 100 leads and our lead volume is growing at 25, 50% per year. Right. What it's going to show is every month my lead volume increases and my conversions work, et cetera. And what we have to understand is, and I learned this, firsthand as a financial advisor, right? I can average X% growth, but if the order of operation is out of order, goes out of order, it dramatically changes what the outcome is. And that's why it needs a volume. I remember I worked with somebody who had been the president of Velcro, and he had retired from Velcro and started a consulting business. He was running he did a consulting and peer advisory business. He had a peer coaching program. And I worked with him for about 9 months, 12 months. I forget exactly. It doesn't matter. And he ended up just going into full retirement. And what he talked about is he said, when he was at Velcro, he could go into his system, he could look at what was happening, and he would have pretty good accuracy in terms of what was next month, next quarter, and the quarter after that, what was that going to look like? Right. And also was able to, wait, we're beginning to look a little bit light. Here's what we need to do. Are we on course? Are we off course? And the thing that he had was he got to live by what's called the law of large numbers. Right. Mm-hmm. He talked about Velcro being a much more predictable business, and he kept trying to and so he viewed that, because again, he was the president of Velcro. He didn't look at the deal by deal data.
Right.
Right. And so one of the things that in our conversations that I helped him understand was that the deals that Velcro was running were probably not that much more predictable than the deals that he was running, but Velcro was running thousands of deals over long periods of time. He was running 10. Right. And so if you don't have that volume, then the model breaks down. And by the way, what it also does is it works really well when times are good. So when you have a wind at your back, it looks really good. It feels really good. It builds more and more confidence. Yeah. You think you're predicting and you're not, right? Because that's the other benefit of it is overall, it's a relatively simple and easy model to automate for ongoing forecasting and predictability.
So the that all makes sense. And where this resonated with me, and it's because project management is my world that I live in. Like, this reminded me so much of why people love a waterfall project plan. It's very clear, it's very easy to follow, and just like you said, as long as there's not disruption, it looks great and all works. But as soon as you have a disruption, the whole thing falls apart. It's like that's what this made me think of.
You know, one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons of all time was one where Dilbert had presented his manager the presentation for the board, and his manager says, the board will never go for this. And Dilbert basically replies, well, what should I do? And his response was double the assumptions. And do you remember, I think it was like the fourth to last, I think it was the sixth episode of the last season of Succession, when Jeremy Strong was doing the product launch, right, senior living, and he was trying to blow up the deal for Waste. I can't believe I'm going blank on the company that bought Waystar.
I can't remember either. Oh, Mojo, yeah.
Gojo, right?
Gojo, yeah.
Right. And so he said, well, what if we juice the growth to 50%, and we increase the rent, and we did this and we did this, like that could work. That could work, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Right. We've got to make these numbers pop. You can do that with waterfall plan, right? So the cons of this, the downside is, if the data is not accurate, the forecast is really not accurate, and it looks like it's accurate.
Yep.
Right. This is funny because this is where a typo can really confuse you, even if you're the one who created it. I'm like, review mirror. It's a rear view mirror.
Oh, there we go. I was excited to hear about mirror data.
So, well, the funny thing is, there is a mirror data issue here, right? So that's what I connected it to. But what I'm talking about here is a rear view mirror, right? You're predicting the future by looking at the past.
Yep.
Now, if you're Velcro, if you're GE, if you're Amazon, if you're Microsoft, you've got the data, like, that's okay. Now, I say it's okay. It's always okay until it's not okay.
Yeah.
But you are using historical data.
Yep.
To drive future predictability. And I read somewhere that past performance is no guarantee of future results. The mirror element, which I didn't write down initially, is you build in this reinforcement loop where the data feeds on the data feeds on the data. So you're basically, in your funnel conversion, in your waterfall, right? You're building assumptions on top of assumptions on top of assumptions.
Yep.
So if one goes wrong in the wrong way, you can be in a lot of trouble. For all the things that happen, and in SaaS following the pandemic, that led to some pretty significant abrupt layoffs, and the level that management, to some degree, deserved some of the vitriol. But the part that I understood is that was an example of waterfall plan. That was an example of that feedback loop error that happens, is their initial modeling was off to the low end. And by the way, if you're trying to grow, the failure to generate the volume of business that you want to generate, that is painful.
Yep.
The inability to manage the demand that's coming to you, that is 10 times the problem of not getting, which was the problem that they were having, right? So these demand assumptions were off, not significantly, but they were stacked, where the errors were stacked.
Yep.
Which led them to be under allocated, which put them into a hire at all cost, quote, grow at all cost. That then we had a reversion to the mean, and everything got blown up. That is an example of that feedback issue. So it's really easy to miss insights, because ultimately what you're doing is you're running big averages.
Yeah.
This is also one of the things I would do here is I would run this on cohorts. I would not run a waterfall model on all my business. And by the way, if
Gotcha.
your volume's not big enough to run this on cohorts, then it's probably not big enough. The data set's probably not big enough for this to be an effective means for forecasting. The last downside is it's a very low feedback loop. Because again, you're looking at everything, you're running everything at a macro level. So if you miss up or down, it's very difficult to attribute the cause.
Yep.
And by the way, it's very easy to look like you're wrong without even necessarily being wrong. And that is, again, because you're not accounting for the variability. Realize that not only do you have to, like for waterfall planning to work well, you not only have to get the conversion rate, the waterfall rate, you have to be accurate there. You also have to be accurate on time.
Oh, okay. I see. Yep.
Right. So if I'm off, deals close faster or things move faster or slower, that also will dramatically change.
Okay. If things move faster or slower.
As things move faster or slower, that will also dramatically change your.
Okay.
So if things happen faster, we take a jump up. We're not properly resource allocated.
Right.
Right. So it looks like, hey, we're geniuses, we're superstars. And again, that's the example that I talked about on that feedback loop. So it's
Throws
very
your whole
hard.
model off. Yep.
All right, that's the hard one. Once you understand waterfall planning, the next ones become easier to understand.
Okay.
The next type of forecasting is what I would refer to as stage-based forecasting or milestone-based forecasting. Mm-hmm. This is probably the most common B2B type. And this is basically looking at, we're looking at our pipeline. Each stage has a probability. By the way, you know who you can blame for this?
Who?
Salesforce.
I almost said Salesforce.
I can't tell you that SAP and others before Salesforce didn't have this, but Salesforce introduced with your deal stage, you also gave a probability weighting.
Yeah.
That was the first time I did stage-based probability. And I remember looking at it like, oh my God, this is genius. Like we look at it and 10% of the deals that we generate close. So in, stage one has a 10% probability. But again, that's what it is. So typically stage-based is where we're looking at, every deal has a close date. It has estimated value and it has a stage. And so you take the estimated value times the probability, attribute it to the close date, and you build your model.
Super easy.
It's why it's so popular.
Yeah.
Now you know what? It's super easy, and it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, kind of.
And by the way, if you were to do a regression analysis and your data was robust enough, it would work. Again, you're dealing with a law of large numbers. By the way, going back to waterfall planning for a second, this is why data scientists exist, right? So the data scientist is the one who's working those data sets to be able to develop those insights. And again, it's hard because trust me, all those companies that had big misses that led them to the layoffs that they had and write-offs that they had really good data scientists seeking insight.
Right. Yeah.
So again, intuitively, it makes sense. It feels right. 10% of the people who start, 25% from here, so-and-so from here. The problem is it's not that predictable, right? So again, let's go over the pros.
Yeah.
It's a simple way. It's very clear. It's intuitive, and it's really easy to automate. It makes for really good dashboards.
Yep.
Now, here's the other thing, and we can't, again, I learned this when I was a financial advisor as well. We have far more periods of growth than we have periods of retraction.
Yep.
And so we're far more likely to have a wind at our back than to have a headwind. And so what happens is the numbers are off, but they're made up by a tailwind that makes them that enables you not to realize that they're as off. And so these models really seep in and you this is where we get into the conversations about correlation, causation, et cetera. And I don't mean to be going down that rabbit hole, but that's why simple and automated forecasting models look and feel good. That's why everyone jumped on this bandwagon. And to some degree, that's why, the credibility of why MQLs are not good, right? It's actually not the problem of the MQL. It's the problem of how we manage the MQL and how we went about building that into this idea of a forecasting model.
Well, and if you don't have the data to be able to really know how to add predictability or probability and attribute it, it's really easy. It feels really good. It's super clean. Just go with
correct
10% in stage 1, 50% in stage 2, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Right. And then the other thing that happens is you run into this good arts problem, right? So the favorite agreement that I've ever worked, I won't name the company, but they insisted that we be performance-based. Mm-hmm. And we were feeding an SDR team. And so what they wanted was MQLs. And this was at the height of MQL popularity. And so it was a base fee with a MQL, per MQL bonus that I actually suggest that we put a cap on it. Mm-hmm. But guess what we did? We fought hard for the definition of MQL that we wanted.
Yep.
And this lead right here, I mean, if you look at it in the corner, it meets that definition.
Right.
Give me my $50. Right. I mean, that's what happens. So when we make that it doesn't take long for a salesperson to realize that's what's driving the forecast, and the forecast is what keeps the manager off your right. And that drives those issues. And so the con of it is it's highly, highly flawed, right? Mm-hmm. It makes the mistake that proximity is probability. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yep.
And it becomes stage-based instead of deal-based.
Right.
Right. Which also makes it very hard for you to have insight.
Yep.
Right. When you're right, why were you right? By the way, here's the thing that's interesting. Very few people complain when their forecast is wrong to the downside.
Right. Sure.
Right. What they do is they say, yeah, we outperformed.
We knocked it out of the park. Yeah.
And then we'll talk about this next week. Then they get their butt kicked by the reversion to the mean.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
You remember Ryan, I had this conversation. He had a quarter where they beat their forecast by 70%.
Yeah.
And so he revised all his future forecasts. He's like, I think he raised them by 30%. And then he didn't even hit half of the forecast the next quarter. Right. And I'm like, but if you look at where he had been in the first half of the year, like in the 2 quarters, he would have been ahead.
Yeah. Right.
So flaw of stage-based went to this next form, which is the commit.
Yeah.
Right. And so we went from it being stage-based. By the way, one of the other problems with stage-based is the participant, the seller, has no agency.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, well, this says 70%, but I know it's not 70%.
Yeah.
And so the commit approach is reps categorize, reps mark their deal, or you can automate it based on stage, profile, etc., into typically 3 categories. I see it done on 2 or 3 categories. Commit, like sometimes I see it as commit in best case. Sometimes I see it as commit probable in best case.
Yep.
Now here, what you're doing, most of the people who run this still use stage-based. But what they're doing with the commit-based is this is how they're managing their monthly or quarterly. So is it commit, probable, or best case for this month, this quarter?
Right. Yeah.
This is becoming common in higher velocity B2B sales. One of the things I like about it is it does involve rep participation.
Right.
And if you use it correctly, it enables you to better close the loop.
Yeah.
But the downside is it's very arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right. And every rep that I know that uses this goes, looks at their commits, and commits are treated as 100%.
Right.
They look at their commit and they go, look, I know that I'm not going to get all my commits, but I always have a deal or two that comes in at the very end that I never expected. It's like, okay, wait a second. If what we're trying to do is build predictability, right? Now, our forecast confidence approach is similar to this, but we're using that throughout the entire process. And so again, the other con or another con of this is very little learning takes place. And it creates a very late stage focus. And again, I want to emphasize that salespeople, as a sale progresses, the level of influence that the salesperson has decreases. So they have far more leverage and influence early than late. Again, obviously late is when it connects to revenue. Bottom up, that is in whatever manner that's there for whatever period, each rep, each individual, each business unit, whatever reports up on each individual opportunity or each group. This can be effective in high value, low volume businesses. The pros, there's a little bit more reality here because someone's calling on it. There's rep participation. Downside, it's really complicated. It's also far too often arbitrary. But by the way, I've done this, and if I'm in a good place, it looks better. And if I'm in a bad place, my numbers are going to look worse.
You took the words out of my mouth because we've run these before internally and with clients, and it is kind of like how am I feeling this week? But it does drive a lot of collaboration. It's also really, as somebody who's not had to run them but witnessed running, like it's really, really hard to run that and hold the rep accountable for why they're saying what they're saying and their justification for it. Cause it is, like I said, it is a lot of like, how am I feeling this week?
It's collaborative when it's run well. And it's hard to run well. Top down, I jokingly refer to top down as we're going to grow by 25%. Though sometimes, for whatever reason, you might need to grow by 1%. So you're calling that. If you actually look at how most businesses run, especially if they're funded or public, is they do a version of top down, bottom up, where their bottom up analysis, like they require their bottom up to be 120 at the very low end to 150 or even 100. I'm seeing recently 160% of their top end. So by the way, this whole conversation about 50% of reps don't meet quota. Well, 30 to 40% of reps aren't supposed to meet quota.
Right.
A typical public company that's reporting or a funded company that's reporting to their funders sets quota at 140 to 150% of what they've told their board. Right. So you have this artificial element that's there, but the top-down forecasting, which is what drives a lot of the issues around forecasting, is, well, we need to grow at 30% this year. Well, wait, the system's not showing 30% growth. Right? I will say that I think the best way is a little bit of all of these.
Well, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned you want to run multiple types of forecasting. Why is that the ideal approach?
All things in balance, Jess. Everything works and nothing works. What was it? That was in an episode of West Wing. They were talking about the budget, and Donna's parents were visiting. And it's like a good diet, a little bit of everything. And then Bartlett was in a session. He's like, well, Josh, the truth is, dealing with a recession, that you didn't say the R word, right? Bagels. So anyhow. There's an old phrase, the map is not the terrain. So the model is never the truth.
Right.
And the problem is models will get on a roll. Right. And then you then build in a whole lot of confirmation bias. So running multiple models is beneficial. You also find that, look, we're doing, like, if you go into any year, no business that I'm aware of, I'm sure there's some, but no business that I'm aware of goes on to January 1st with every piece of business that they're going to win that year, every dollar of revenue that they're going to win that year identified. And by the way, even in their hard backlog that's driving their revenue forecast, something's going to happen that's going to cause some of that to be missed. Something else is going to come in. So that waterfall model helps you account for some of what should be happening that's feeding the engine, that's feeding the machine.
Yep.
Right. What I'd like to do, and we'll get into this more next week about it, is to build in that predictability. So we're hitting a lot of the underlying forecasting elements by building that into the deal profile.
Yeah.
Right. So when we look at forecast confidence, we're using that in a way, not just to forecast,
right,
but also to manage the strategy for how we're managing that deal. Mm-hmm. Further, how we're allocating resources for that deal.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's why I think a little bit of everything. The key is, how do you close the loop? How do you go back? How are you reinforcing and driving better learning?
Yep. I have a couple of takeaways. Next week, we're going to dig into common purposes, why this is so freaking hard, and how to create and fix forecasts. We're going to dig into those next week. A couple of takeaways. So forecast is predictability. When you're predicting the future, there's always going to be variability, goodness gracious. But without that predictability, you can't really make decisions. So this should be kind of your guide to the decisions you're making. Running multiple types of forecasts gives you the most effective forecast, what you just hit on. And then I think one thing that gets lost when we're talking about forecasting frequently with clients is forecasting is the end of good process, not the beginning of it. And we frequently have folks who want to start with forecast, and you can't do that. You got to have good process, good tracking, good structure. It's at the end of that. Forecasting comes at the end of that.
Yeah, I think another way of saying that is, a lot of people want to come in and say, I need to fix my forecasting.
Yeah.
And far more often than not, as a matter of fact, if all you need to do is fix your forecasting, you probably don't need to fix your forecasting.
Right. Yep.
Now, you may need to fix your forecasting. Like, you might not be forecasting well, but I've never seen a situation where there's not a process problem underneath and there's not an issue that's happening before you get to that forecast that needs to be addressed. Because if there's no clear documented business process, there is no consistency. And if there is no consistency, then you can't have predictability.
Yep.
And the question is, how do you have consistency in a complex variant ecosystem, in a complex variant process? That's the challenge. That's why we exist.
Yep.
And Jess, if you can say yes to good forecasting, you know what else you can do? You can say no to shitty RevOps.
Till next time.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of the RevOps Show. One line that really stood out to me today: for forecasting to be predictable, it's the end of a good process, not the beginning. It's not usually your forecasting that's off, it's your model. And as a reminder, if you're looking to refine your growth model, we do have a course for you linked in the show notes. Next week, Doug and Jess will be back for part 2, diving into the common challenges in forecasting, why it can be so tricky, and how to create more accurate forecasts. Thanks for tuning in this week. Listen to the rest of the show on your favorite podcast listening platform. Follow the show, rate the show, share the show even. We would really appreciate it. If you'd like to follow Doug, Jess, or Lyft, you can find us all on LinkedIn. But until next time, just say no to shitty RevOps.